Good evening. Or actually still afternoon, I think. It's not even getting dark at 4:30 anymore. Welcome to spring in Maine. My name is Andy Rudalevich. I'm the chair of the Department of Government and Legal Studies here at Bowdoin. It's a real pleasure to welcome you here tonight to beautiful Brunswick, Maine. It has been a pleasure putting together this program, and it's an evening 50 years in the making, really. I should note that on May 14th, 1973, Senator Sam Ervin spoke at Bowdoin. So in a way, we are coming full circle. It's exciting to have with us two hugely accomplished individuals, people who know so much from quite different perspectives about Richard Nixon, the Watergate affair, and the resonance of that experience in not just American politics, but in our cultural memory over the last 5 decades. Watergate's impact, of course, goes well beyond the vocabulary of scandal, where everything gets a gate added to it. And our conversation tonight, I hope, will explore exactly that. So let me introduce our terrific guests more briefly, frankly, than they deserve, so that we can jump into the substance. So first, John Dean. John is a best-selling author, legal expert, an educator, and a political commentator. He served as a staffer on the House Judiciary Committee, later as Associate Deputy Attorney General in the Department of Justice, before serving as White House counsel from 1970 to 73, and then, spoiler alert, getting fired from that position as part of President Nixon's purge of the White House staff 50 years and 4 days ago. John has testified before Congress on many occasions, ranging from the Ervin Committee investigation of Watergate to the Senate Judiciary Committee's oversight on wiretapping in the War on Terror, and remains an important voice in American political discourse. He's a frequent contributor to MSNBC, CNN, and other networks, and was an executive producer for CNN's 4-part documentary series last year entitled Watergate: Blueprint for a Scandal. Among his many books are Blind Ambition, The Rehnquist Choice, a biography of fellow Ohioan Warren G. Harding, Worse Than Watergate, The Nixon Defense, What He Knew and When He Knew It, and most recently, Authoritarian Nightmare, Trump and His Followers. Timothy Naftali is director of NYU's undergraduate public policy program with a joint appointment in the Department of History and the Wagner School at New York University. He came to NYU after serving as a consultant to the 9/11 Commission and as the first federal director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. In Yorba Linda, he authored the library's new Watergate Gallery and oversaw the release of over 1 million pages of documents and over 350 hours of the Nixon White House tapes. He is a prolific author for both scholarly and general audiences, and his many articles have appeared in outlets ranging from the New York Times to the Atlantic to Foreign Affairs. His books include One Hell of a Gamble and Khrushchev's Cold War, written with Alexander Fursenko, biography of George H.W. Bush, and Impeachment, An American History. You've likely seen him on your TV as well. He's also a CNN presidential historian and has contributed to numerous documentaries, including the aforementioned Watergate: Blueprint for a Scandal. So before our speakers take the stage, let's set that stage. If you can cast your mind back 50 years this week, our crack AV staff is going to bring some magic to the room.
The biggest White House scandal in a century, the Watergate scandal, broke wide open today. The Attorney General, Richard Kleindienst, has resigned because, in his own words, he had close personal and professional associations with people who may have broken the law. The two closest men to the president, H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, and John Ehrlichman, his chief domestic advisor, have resigned. Last week, both men were fighting hard to keep their jobs. The president's White House legal counsel, John Dean, has been fired. Reportedly, Dean is implicated in efforts to cover up the Watergate scandal, and he may implicate Ehrlichman and Haldeman. The Secretary of Defense, Elliot Richardson, will be nominated as Attorney General. Leonard Garment of the White House will fill in for John Dean. All this in a presidential statement read by Press Secretary Ron Ziegler.
The President has asked me to announce that he has today received and accepted the resignation of Richard Kleindienst as Attorney General of the United States. He is appointing Elliot Richardson to succeed Mr. Kleindienst as Attorney General, and will submit Mr. Richardson's name to the Senate for confirmation immediately. President Nixon has also asked me to announce that he is today accepting the resignation of two of his closest friends and most trusted assistants in the White House, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman. The president told them he knew their decision to resign was difficult and that his decision to accept it was also difficult. But he also said that he respects and appreciates the attitude that led them to it. The president wishes to emphasize that neither the submission nor the acceptance of Mr. Haldeman's and Mr. Ehrlichman's resignation at this time should be seen by anyone as evidence of any wrongdoing by either one. Such assumptions would be both unfair and unfounded. I've also been asked to announce that the president has today requested and accepted the resignation of John Dean from his position of the White House counsel.
John Dean, Tim Naftali, please come on up. Give them a warm Bowdoin welcome. Again, welcome. Thanks for being here. We're going to jump right in, if that's okay, given limited time. John, just watching that clip, I noticed Ron Ziegler, the White House press secretary, didn't say any nice things about you the way that he did about Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Ehrlichman. And President Nixon did about the same in his speech to the nation that night. Curious about your recollections about the period that led up to this and I suppose just after. If I recall correctly, you were supposedly writing a Dean report until you weren't. And in Blind Ambition, your memoir, you note about that day that when asked what the president would say on television, you remembered, "I wanted to believe that somehow he would do the right thing. I should have known he could not."
First, let me thank you for warning me we're being taped tonight. And we know where the machine that records is. The other thing I'd like to note is that when I came over to the campus, I was thinking, should I wear a hat or should I not wear a hat? And the reason I started wearing a hat is I recently had an incident in the LA airport. And most times when people come up to me and they recognize me, it's because I'm on CNN. This man, I could see him sort of hedging, and he wasn't sure if to come up or not. And finally he gets the courage to come up and he said, "Didn't you used to be Vice President Dick Cheney?" I said, "I think you've got the wrong person." So I came over not incognito tonight, happy to be here with you all. But what was on my mind when I actually did not see the announcement that he was firing everybody. As the tapes show, right after that event, he tells Ziegler that he is actually firing everybody. This was a nice way to make it public for Haldeman and Ehrlichman. There was just no doubt about me because he had been debating for many, many weeks what to do. I had gone in and told him that his presidency was in a whole lot of trouble, and that made me a serious problem for him. I don't know how deep in the weeds we want to get tonight, although I see a lot of white tops out there that will understand this better than the young students that I see here. But anyway, this is a pausing culmination when things take a turn and actually get much worse for Nixon as the history unfolds. And that's what I fully expected when I was in New York. I was actually testifying in front of another grand jury in the Southern District of New York, which was targeting Nixon's Attorney General, John Mitchell, and his Secretary of Commerce, Maurice Stans, who both would be indicted. And the Southern District, who has a wonderful reputation for being such savvy lawyers, was about to make and did make a terrible mistake. They wanted to steal some of the thunder of Watergate by bringing their own case and using me as a witness to events I really had no knowledge about. So I would end up testifying in that trial, and there was a very strong jury foreman who said neither Mitchell nor Stans is guilty of anything, and gave them a pass. It was a hung jury. So that began speculation, well, maybe Dean won't make a very good witness. So this is a clip of an event in 925 days of events, most of which were fairly spectacular. And we look back on now through the lens of Donald Trump, and they weren't quite that spectacular.
No, that said, just to go into one weed anyway, and I just want to give a shout out to my Watergate and American politics students who are here, who are very immersed in this particular piece of shrubbery. One of the days that you alluded to this is March 21st, 1973, right. Just over a month before, and you're sitting in front of the president, and he's asking you how much money is going to be required to maintain the silence of the Watergate burglars.
Well, what happens is on March 21st, is a result of somebody coming in my office 24 hours earlier and saying, Howard Hunt, and by this time I realized we're making serious mistakes, we're committing crimes, and we've got to stop. It's not going to work, we're all getting deeper involved, and if anybody has to get in front of this, it's Richard Nixon, or it's going to destroy his presidency. So with that in mind, he had called me on the night of the 19th, and I broke all protocol, which was if you wanted to meet with the president, you went through the chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, and set it up. I had him on the phone. I said, Mr. President, I need to talk to you. I don't need Bob Haldeman, the chief of staff there. I don't need John Ehrlichman there. I just need to talk to you because I think you need some information you don't have. I was giving him the benefit of the doubt. But still I knew I would be giving him some information he didn't have. So I went in, and to make sure I had his attention, I started the conversation by saying, after some small talk, that there was a cancer on his presidency. And after that, I did have his attention. Often when I talked to him, his feet were up on the desk, and he'd be talking to me around his shoes. And I was never sure how close he was following. And after I told him there was a cancer on his presidency, both feet were on the ground. And I later realized from his diary, he said, well, not much happened around here, excepting Dean came in and said there was a cancer on the presidency. So that lasted, and that remark got his attention. I then spent an hour and 50 minutes with him, 50 minutes of him trying to tell him how the cover-up that was happening would not work, and that only he could deal with it. And at one point I said, the burglars who were involved want more money, and that's where the $1 million would come up. He said, well, how much would they want? And I said, and I pulled out of thin air a number I thought he would find offensive, and pulled the $1 million out, and he said, well, John, that's no problem. It was that phase of the conversation I realized I wasn't carrying the argument that he should do something about the cover-up. And it really, I went over everything I could think of that would be a problem. Like one of the members of the staff had testified and had told me he thought he had committed perjury. Now, Nixon knew a lot about perjury from his early days in really stimulating the indictment of Alger Hiss, who was a young State Department official that Nixon did not particularly like. So I knew he knew perjury, and when I told him that Bud Krogh had believed he had committed perjury, his response caught me totally off guard. He said, well, John, perjury is a very tough rap to prove. Like, you just have to twist that a little bit. As he later coaches, Haldeman and Ehrlichman say, I don't know, and you will be safe. And they would do just that. So the March 21st meeting was the meeting where I laid so much out that I knew he couldn't deal with me. I closed my hour and 50-minute session by telling him, Mr. President, people are going to go to jail. And he says, like who? And rather than point my finger, I said, like me. He said, no, John. He said, you're the lawyer. The lawyers don't go to jail.
So did you see him again in that next month and a bit?
I
before
did.
You were
it's very interesting. I I did a book where I had to transcribe all Nixon's tapes. It's called The Nixon Defense. It took me 4.5 years using graduate students who I tutored, and they got to recognize the voice. But I found it much easier for me, rather than to start with a blank sheet of paper and try to do it, to have somebody fill the page in and then correct it. And that became the fastest way, and they were always a little bit ahead of me. I kept it working that way. But it was an awesome project because the quality of the Nixon secret tapes is in direct relationship to the proximity of the speaker to the hidden microphone. And not many people, the microphones were all hidden in his desk in the various venues where they had wired it. And nobody sat around the desk except in the Oval Office. I happened to notice I was always seated right by a microphone, which is great.
Okay.
I mean, when I became White House counsel in my early 30s, what I was getting is not the job that would be the president's lawyer, because I knew my predecessor would hold that and keep a foot on my shoulder and make sure that he remained White House counsel as well as Chief Domestic Advisor, a fellow by the name of John Ehrlichman. And that's pretty much the way it played out. So Nixon doesn't call on me in Watergate until very late, when almost about 800, 900 days in after the arrest at the Watergate complex, it triggers the whole episode. Let me just when I refer to Watergate, I'm thinking something very different than most of you all. And most people think of Watergate as a bungled burglary and then a bungled cover-up. Watergate is a series of abuses of power that are triggered by the arrest at the Democratic National Committee. And the big worry for the White House was not the bungled burglary that was prompted by his re-election committee, but it is the fact that others in the White House had used the same characters for actually much more sinister undertakings, like a burglary of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, ordered by no less than John Ehrlichman, who is the number 3 man in the pecking order, or depending on how you count, certainly his top domestic advisor. So Watergate to me is a series of abuses of power and not just a bungled burglary.
Tim, I wanted to ask you from a historian's perspective how you see late April 1973. Is it a pivot point? How does it fit into the broader trajectory of the Watergate affair? It
was a great spring. I was preparing for the science fair in grade 5. We were not a Nixon family. Neither of my parents could vote. They're Canadian. When you want to explain, and John is the best at doing this, but when you want to explain to a generation, or even now two, that didn't experience this. And I think it'd be fun to also talk about what it was like to experience it, really experience it. I'm not talking for those who had been in the White House. Because I think for people who were actually watching it at the time, this was a very confusing Dickensian novel that, seemed to be written by somebody on crack. Or because there were all these weird characters and people there was hush money, and then there's one crazy thing after another. I know that my 11-year-old self couldn't follow any of it, but I don't think my parents could either. But what makes this moment so important is that for the first time in American history, it looked like it was possible that a presidential administration could collapse. Up to that point, the cover-up, although it was cracking, and John can talk about how he knew that the cover-up was cracking, there were things that were happening that made it clear it wasn't just E. Howard Hunt. It was some of the other burglars were beginning to want to talk. it was cracking. Now, the public didn't see that. And so for the public, I think, it all seemed, even though Congress was beginning to investigate it, it seemed as if Nixon would survive. There was no doubt. And with the exception of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein and Seymour Hersh and a few others, the press had largely dropped the issue. And then you have this collapse of the inner circle of the Nixon administration. The firing of, and anybody who knew Nixon or studied Nixon at the time knew that he depended on Ehrlichman and Haldeman. And for him to lose them was, I think he used the term, like cutting off one of his arms, right?
Did.
And I believe his speechwriter, whose name was Ray Price, would later recount the fact that Nixon shared suicidal thoughts the weekend before April 30th, when Nixon was wondering whether he wanted to survive the loss of Ehrlichman and Haldeman. And Ray Price in his memoir talks about that. So, but that was behind the scenes. For the rest of the world, Nixon seemed undaunted. Angrier, you begin to see a slightly more angry Nixon in public. Nixon, unlike Trump, actually tried to shield the public from his inner turmoil. But these resignations and firings signaled that something was deeply wrong at the center of this administration. And so I think changed the tenor of this crisis for most people, because at that point it looked like, hey, Richard Nixon's administration might not survive. So it's a major turning point inside the White House, but also outside. So I think that's how it's turning.
Let me just add why Tim has the credentials to talk about this and speaks with some authority, because he's more than just a scholar who studied this period. He's virtually met everybody. When the family decided and realized they could not run the Nixon Foundation and home in Yorba Linda, and they didn't have any papers because they were all in College Park, Maryland, David and Julie, the president's son-in-law and daughter, realized they needed federal assistance, and hopefully they could get into the presidential library system. Well, to make that story very short, because David had some friends in high places, they were able to put that together, and one of the last libraries of non-presidents in that system was added to the system. Tim was the first person who had legitimate archival knowledge and credentials to come in and take over that phase of the operation, which is totally different than the museum and the Nixon Foundation, although housed at the same place. It had to be rebuilt and re-expanded to meet all the criteria of someplace that can keep federal records. And what he really did that got everybody angry is he put out a legitimate Watergate exhibit. And that's why he has it on his resume, because it is a resume-worthy undertaking. They fought him internally, externally, every way you can. But more importantly to me, and this is something that's online, is Tim went around and talked to everybody who was directly or tangentially important to understanding the Nixon presidency. And it's a remarkable library. It's a video, audio combined online facility now, and you can't first prepare to talk to these people without doing a lot of study, and then you learn something when you talk to them. So he speaks with some authority of knowing these players that is really rather unique. So it's fun having him here tonight.
Well, thank you, Jeff.
He understands these things.
Well, Tim, actually, we might as well tee up this question, because I am, of course, curious about what you found, right, on the ground, effectively, when you got out to Yorba Linda. I was somebody who had visited the old version of the Watergate exhibit, and perhaps you could talk about what that was like and how the family was trying to tell this history, which it's fair to say was not exactly in line with factual events.
Well, you think Watergate is a long story, and I won't bore you because there's a lot that I think all of us would like to hear John speak to. In our country, we tend to honor presidents, and that's the right thing, I would say. If a person is the head of state of a country, well, they're head of state. The First Amendment gives us the right to, it should and does, give us the right to critique, criticize. But this, because of the decision the founders made, our president is not just head of government. Our president is commander-in-chief and head of state. That's an almost unique combination of roles in a democracy. The French president has it too. And what's, I think, very interesting about us is that when that president leaves office, even though they're no longer responsible for those three very important duties, they continue to hold the respect, at least of the people who voted for them. Because Franklin Roosevelt decided that he would have a presidential library. Herbert Hoover has a library, but it's a Me Too kind of library, comes later. Because of that, we, even though presidents until later didn't get a pension when they left office, this institution, sort of institutionalized legacy building began as part of the presidential idea. And one of the consequences, it wasn't necessary, but it did happen, was the sense that if a president has a library, that library will tell only the good story of the president, because that's how you honor someone who's been had those three major positions. That's okay, I guess, if a president primarily does good things, but every single president we've ever had has been flawed because they're all human beings, right? So there is an inner tension when you ask the National Archives, which is a nonpartisan organization that is there to protect documents, not to interpret them, protect them, when you couple them with a legacy building organization. And that is at the heart of the dissonance in every single presidential library. Now, talk about Nixon, where you have an existing private library, which is completely in the legacy building, and it's not only legacy building, it is a dark Disneyland, okay? It's not, I mean, look, I wrote a book with a Russian, which is another dark Disneyland, but I mean, I wrote a book about Khrushchev and the United States, and I went to the private Nixon library. I had visited that place. I knew what it was like, and it was outrageous. In fact, there were a bunch of friends that later lived in West Hollywood and who would tell me how they'd go on little tours of the Nixon Library because it was so campy. I mean, because the history was so out there. I mean, so their library, their museum had an exhibit about Watergate that blamed the Democrats for Watergate. That seemed, it's beyond belief, all right? So when the National Archives, when the Congress, because only Congress could do this, amended the law that governs Nixon materials, I worked under one law that was designed actually for that job. When the National Archives, the Congress amended the law to allow Nixon's materials to leave 30 miles of the Capitol, they were kept there to protect them when Nixon was alive, fearing that they'd be destroyed if they went to California. Not because of climate change, but because of 18.5-minute change gaps. When they changed that law, the US government had this problem, which is, how are we going to create legitimacy for an archive which had a lot of legitimacy in Washington. You used it in Washington, D.C. When we move it to this dark Disneyland. And that was my job, and you paid my salary, thank you very much, was to create legitimacy for that place. And part of it was to change the Watergate exhibit. Now, my background is I'm a historian. I am not a museum curator. I learned a lot about museum curation and a lot about public history. I admire those folks, and to some extent, I've now contributed to it. Why did I do that? Because the National Archives, with the exception of some of you may have been, how many have been to the museum in DC? It's a really nice museum, okay? National Archives did that. It wrote the text. Normally it doesn't do that. National Archives doesn't like to write museum text because it means you're interpreting. And that undermines the objectivity that is expected of a place that protects documents. So how did I end up writing, what would arguably be one of the more controversial exhibits in a federal space? It's because the Nixonians didn't want to do it. The National Archives, when it was negotiating the construction of this new entity, wanted them, I don't know if you knew this story, wanted them to do the new Watergate gallery. And they couldn't do it. Why couldn't they do it? They couldn't do it because guess who wrote the text of the Watergate gallery? Does anyone want to guess? Come on, Richard Nixon. He didn't dictate it all, but he actually edited it. And it was like scripture. And the daughters couldn't agree on how to change Daddy's words. And one of the things they didn't want to talk about were the plumbers. Exactly, John didn't use the word plumbers, but he was talking about the break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office. In other words, the dirty tricks and worse of 1971. So when the Nixonians participated in my hiring, because both sides had to be happy, and I'd never written about Nixon except in a book about counter-espionage, counterterrorism, and what I said wasn't controversial. The head of the Nixon Foundation, who was also the executor of his estate, said to the Archivist of the United States, we want Naftali to write it because we can't do it. And that's how, so I'm not a Watergate expert. I taught a class in it, but not a class like Andy.
You are now.
And now. But they say, I want you to do it. Now, hey, I'm a historian. I love a challenge. It wasn't like I said, oh, I can't do this. But the fact of the matter is, so the federal government found itself doing something it doesn't like to do. And as John said, it was a controversial thing. But what I learned, and this is what we need, I think this is something I want to convey to folks. What I learned was how hard it is to persuade people to change their mind about a president that they love. And so for me, this was a pre-education in the experience we've all had in the last few years that I didn't anticipate, most of us didn't, of course, either. I saw that. I saw how hard, we tried so hard with, we had all these wonderful volunteers, they're called docents, and we became responsible for those that had been recruited by the foundation. And we wondered, well, how are we going to share with them? Because there was a list of books they could read, and they were only books written by Nixon. They were not allowed to read any other books. Honest, there was a list of, so when we met with them to try to upgrade or change or revise the tours for students, they didn't know anything about they'd never heard of the plumbers. They didn't know who Daniel Ellsberg was. All they knew was the dark Disneyland version of Watergate that had been in the museum. So I was like, what do you do without being, because I studied the Civil War. I wasn't going to be a carpetbagger. I was born in Canada, which made it even worse. I remember, I remember saying to someone, I said, really, this may not be the right fit. I'm a U.S. citizen now, and I was then at that point. I'm Canadian. I'm a liberal. I'm gay. Maybe I'm not the right fit for this job. But the National Archives thought I might be. But the point was that for this group of really nice people, smart people, it was, in the end, a failed effort to try to bring them along. Not to make them liberal or gay or Canadian, but just to open their minds, okay, to this. And so we tried. I played tapes for them. They thought I'd made them in Washington. We would play an anti-Semitic part. There was a whole, I forgot to say Jewish too. And they thought I had created these tapes. They hated this man. Part of the religion was that this was the Antichrist. And so I'm afraid the lesson I learned.
And what did he do to deal with that? He invited me out, gave me a stage, and had me sell one of my books at the Nixon Library.
Well, yeah. Now, one last story, and I'll stop because you have other questions. Some of you may have heard of a man named Hugh Hewitt. Some of you know who Hugh is? He's still a prominent conservative commentator. Hugh Hewitt was briefly the director of the Nixon Library when it was a private library, and he famously said that there was an enemies list. He said, Bob Woodward, Carl Bernstein, and John Dean will never darken the threshold of this library. He was actually fired within a few weeks, but the point is that I was told when I arrived by the Nixon Foundation, in no uncertain terms, that their willingness to cooperate with me depended on my not inviting certain people. And I went public, I went public about how we would be open for everyone. We would be nonpartisan, that communists and socialists and anarchists and conservatives and liberals and progressives all pay taxes to this place, and all of them could come. And I made sure, because I saw my job as taking the Band-Aid off, that before I left, Carl Bernstein, Bob Woodward, and this gentleman would be there. Because if they didn't, how could you make the argument that it was open and legitimate? It would mean that there was still an enemies list. And for God's sakes, that administration of all administrations should be the most worried about the legacy of enemies lists. So that's why you got invited.
Let me ask a question. How many saw the May 1 edition on HBO of the White House Plumbers? It has nothing to do with reality. just you know, if you happen to see it, I have not seen it. Someone told me and repeated what was in it. I live in a town that's a very small town with our industry in the films. Someone sent me the script very early. I read the script. At the end of the first episode, Hunt and Liddy come to my office, which is not really my office, but I'm sitting in Bud Krog's office, and I offer them $1 million to go over to the re-election committee and do their thing that they've done at the White House, which I have, in fact, no idea what they've done at the White House.
Well, that's how it opened?
And that's how it opens. So it might be another run of fiction that we're seeing. I have a theory that if you read, this film is based on a true story, be very careful. It has nothing to do with the truth or that story.
Well, I wonder, I mean, you've both touched in different ways on the understanding of history as opposed to the pure recitation of facts. One thing that's of interest to me is sort of, you know, you're living through it, and yet there's a lot you don't know about what's going on in the White House. And of course, you wind up testifying before the Ervin Committee in, I think, June of 1973. You're asked to give details of your remembrances of this cancer on the presidency conversation, which you do in great detail, actually. And then, of course, a month later, we find out there are tapes. How are you in sort of, well, so sort of two questions. Sorry for the scholarly complication of the too long a question. But, so on the one hand, as you're finding things out at the time, your reactions to that, but also over the course of 50 years, we know a lot now, partly because of Tim's work releasing many more tapes than had been transcribed back during the actual investigation of Watergate proper. What kind of things do we know now that it would have been nice to know then?
What we know, Nixon might have one of the best documented presidencies in American history. Combination of the recordings that were made, combinations of the records that were kept, and today it's largely all accessible. There's, yes, national security information is not because it's still classified. A lot of the personal material that was recorded has been withdrawn. But by and large, of all American presidencies, you won't find one as well documented. Nixon, during his lifetime, fought that, didn't want it to happen, but ultimately lost. It wasn't only people like Tim getting that information out, it was lawsuits that were brought that said this is public information. The Presidential Records Act, which has become gotten more attention than it might otherwise ever get in the world because of the Mar-a-Lago documents, was adopted because of Nixon and the fact that he might well walk off and destroy everything that was there and have a big bonfire on the South Lawn or in San Clemente. So we do have a remarkable record, and I have learned a lot. When I prepared my testimony, and because of archival interest in what I'm going to do with my papers, I still have the handwritten draft of my testimony. It's about 60,000 words. Had I known it was going to be something I had to sit down and read in front of the Senate committee, I guarantee you it would not have been 60,000 words. I thought I was submitting a document that they could look through and find some questions they might want to ask, and really I saw it as an outline, not a full description, just sort of highlights of what you might want to look into. But anyway, when I submitted the document, I tried to do it in a way that there was no hearsay. I thought very much like a lawyer would. And the only thing I did decide to put in, and it's very evident in the way I wrote the the document, and I've looked at it recently because of the CNN documentary wanted to film some of it. They didn't end up using it, but we looked at it. I had to go pull some of it and take a look at it. And so I looked at this stack of yellow pages where I have written this thing out, and where I have trouble, I can see it's very conspicuous. It comes at the end because I did it in a serial fashion, was the president's conversations. And it's very hard. I know the gist of what he said, but I realized, I actually testified to this at one point because it was very much on my mind, that our memories are not time-stamped. They just are not. You can remember something happened in a range of time, but it was very important. They wanted me to be as specific as possible, which resulted in probably them getting less than I might have otherwise given them, because I wasn't sure on the dates, and I got dates wrong, no question. So looking at that testimony today, as I say, one, had I known I was going to read it, it would never have been 60,000 words. And two, it has held up remarkably well because the tapes would come out and confirm the gist, certainly, of all those conversations. I was driving up today and talking with a friend about it and talking about, I've got a number of publishers asking me to write the bookend to Blind Ambition, which was my first book about this. And now that I've lived with this thing for 50 years, maybe it's time to put a cap on it. And I certainly couldn't agree with that more, that let's put a cap on it. So I'm thinking in terms of how to write that book. And my memory is one of the issues that Tim wisely raised I should probably address. How it works, you can see it so clearly. I think I have a good memory. I'm blessed that it's still there. And I think that's something to lay out in this in this undertaking. What was your question, speaking of memory?
Question.
I had to do that.
Andy, can I ask?
I had to do that.
I would like to ask you a question, because particularly for the young people here, that's most of you, right? You were the most, what was it like to be the most famous person in the United States? In 1973, you were alone, at least as you were depicted, as the challenger to the President of the United States. What was that like? How did you tell us what it was like to be in that position?
You know, first of all, the form I testified in was very familiar. I had been a committee counsel, not in the Senate, but in the House. I'd been to lots of hearings. So the forum was very comfortable. Unlike, it was much different and stranger when I testified for 2 weeks in the trial of Mitchell, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman, and the others in the cover-up trial. That was, the rules are different. There's hearsay, and the judge is there pounding on the gavel, and cross-examination is much more sophisticated by a trained trial lawyer than a member of this House or Senate. So there were very different forms, and I was very comfortable in the Senate forum. But your question is, what was it like to go one-on-one with
the President?
With the President of the United States?
You were on the Time, in that era, the cover of Time magazine mattered. You were on the cover of Time magazine.
What surprised me was the size of the audience, which they reported was about 85 million households. I don't know how many that translates into, but they thought maybe over 100 million, not 85,000, 85 million households. And it translates somewhere probably over 100 million people watched it. I'll tell you one thing, it blows your low profile very quickly. The first time I noticed it was I was in the witness protection program because of the threats against me the week before I testified. The first time I noticed something amiss, and it was a odd, rewarding kind of moment, because it was the first reaction publicly I got, other than a telegram to the committee from Elizabeth Taylor that said, "Get on with it and keep going," who I didn't know Elizabeth Taylor at the time. But I was leaving Washington after my testimony just to get away, because all the press knew where I lived in Old Town. And to get away from the House and out of town, the marshals had made arrangements where I would go visit a friend's house in Marathon, Florida, because nobody was around, and it was just a good isolated location. And to get me there, the marshals arranged all my travel. And so when I got to Atlanta, I had to change planes, and they took me down the back walkway past a mechanic's bay to another plane that I boarded. And all the mechanics had lined up for my walking by and applauded. And that hit me as much as anything during the entire experience. And I thought, these people got the message. So that's probably the most lasting reaction I have.
Beautiful. Yeah, it's interesting though, because of course, President Nixon, the whole White House communications apparatus is saying, well, Dean is lying. And then, as I say, a month later, you know, the tapes come out. You were confident, presumably, the whole time, but still, it must have been shaking.
When I started to explain my testimony, and the end of it, where I have trouble assembling exactly what happened on what day when the President and I are talking, in the 35 conversations that are recorded, there are 37 total, 35 are recorded. So there's a record of virtually everything I said with him, and I can't remember which day what happens, but the interesting thing is they would become the most important part of the testimony. They give the special prosecutor prima facie evidence to subpoena them so he can can get more, so they are important. But where were we going with this?
We're going to talk about the fact that it's your word against the president. This is
Yes.
a little bit of a continuation of Tim's
And
question.
can we add, for context, Mr. Dean testifies before he knows for sure that there's a taping system.
Well,
Although he had suspicions.
that's where we're going.
Yeah.
The reason I testify, I add in my testimony gratuitously, it's the only thing that's really hearsay, that I add in there that I think on April 15th, he has recorded me. And I say in my testimony, if he's recorded me once, it's very likely there are more recordings. I was cross-examined at some length by Howard Baker on that issue, on the what did he know and when did he know it. And Baker is really doubtful there are tapes, that no one would be so foolish as to record all these conversations. And because I don't know for sure, I'm very careful in particular with these things, with these conversations where there might be tapes. And that's where the testimony, the handwriting part of the testimony, slows down to a crawl. And it actually isn't until the second edition, after the first has been typed, that I start filling in more and trying to fill in more. So it has a huge impact on me. And what happens for the rest of the story is I add that to the testimony. After I testify, they're trying to discredit anything and everything I've said. They bring in other people who are in their sort of their dragnet to bring in, and one of them is a fellow by the name of Alex Butterfield. Alex was a deputy White House chief of staff. He was the cabinet secretary. He was the man who took all the papers in for the president to sign and make sure they got to the right people after the president signed them. He was the person that was also, when Haldeman convinces the president they should record all conversations, and they do that for a very specific reason. People are making notes of conversations, and they turn them in to report, what happened, what's interesting historically, who was there, what time, and in particular, what did the president say, so that the person doesn't come out of the meeting and say the president said something different than was actually said during the meeting. That system has broken down, and Haldeman says to the president, we don't have an effective record. It's time to make tapes like Lyndon Johnson did of this presidency. The president says, okay, and that's how it all starts. And as I say, I only have suspicion, and in particular, in this one conversation on April 15th, when I've told him I'm dealing with the prosecutors, and he knows that. And it's clear he's trying to bend my testimony. In all the conversations we'd had, he'd never asked me leading questions. Like, you remember when you came in on March 21st, and we talked about a cancer on the presidency, and I asked you, well, how much could this cost? And you said $1 million, and I said, well, that's no problem. He said, you knew I was joking, didn't you? And I said, well, if you say so, I'm hearing what you. Well, he took me through a series of those questions. One point, he gets up, goes across the room in his executive office, billing office, and in a stage whisper, he said, I was foolish to talk to Chuck Colson, another aide, about clemency for Howard Hunt. And I said, yes, Mr. President, that's probably obstruction of justice. Well, it was clear he didn't want that, and that's when it clicked to me that he's recording this. He wants that answer. He doesn't want that question, and that's why he's way over in the corner of the office by a potted palm. So that's when it dawned on me that there's probably many more of these conversations.
Tim, what was the most surprising thing you found? I mean, you weren't a Watergate guy, you weren't a Nixon guy, as you said, when you went into the Nixon archives, but man, it's like for somebody of your profession, it's like being a kid in a candy store, right? All this stuff that you get to explore, and you wound up releasing much of it publicly.
The National Archives had been in a struggle with the Nixon estate, as John mentioned, the National Archives, and I have tremendous respect for the archives. I enjoyed the 5 years I worked for the archives. The National Archives was under enormous political pressure. And so in some cases, they made decisions. They had to give documents back to the Nixon estate because there was a court order that defined parts of the presidency as private. And that included when the president is the head of a political party. I don't think that was a good decision, but look, I'm not a lawyer. But so the National Archives had to find those documents because the Nixon people wanted everything back. So they had to look and figure out which documents were where the president is being head of state, head of government, commander-in-chief, and those documents where the president is head of the Republican Party. And they erred on the side of caution. So there were documents in the vault that bore on the Watergate story that had never been seen by the Watergate prosecutors. And the National Archives kept them in the hope that someday the Nixon family would evolve such that the fight would end and those could be released. And that moment was the creation of this library, because there was a treaty signed between the Nixon estate and the US government that involved, absolutely, and it involved the returning of those documents that had been deemed political.
I don't know if you know this, Tim. I've seen some of those documents.
I hope so.
Well, the reason is not because I'm an originator of them in the White House, but because I created something called the special files. And during the litigation where Nixon succeeds in convincing the courts that this is a improper constitutional taking, and therefore under the Constitution he's entitled to get them back, and so he's entitled to damages. So there is a bench trial in front of a federal judge in Washington, and I'm the government's witness.
And well, as a result of these struggles, those documents were not returned, they were kept in a vault. And with the signing of the treaty, we could release them. And so you asked me
wait, just a little bit. I'm the guy who went in the shelves and pulled the documents. I had a archive pass. I never had more fun in my life. I was able to literally wander the shelves of the Nixon records and say, oh, this is important, this is important. And it was unbelievable. It was a fascinating, the only thing that was fun connected with any of this.
Well, and so we should share with our audience what some of those documents were, because the Nixon defenders, including the president, had argued that Haldeman, it's very important because I think you'd agree, but I won't put words in your mouth, you can tell me if you don't. If H.R. Haldeman knew something, he was Nixon's chief of staff, Nixon probably knew it. And it was very important to create a firewall to show that Haldeman knew nothing about recruiting Liddy and Hunt and those guys. That it was all John Mitchell, who was the head of the campaign, who was Attorney General and head of the campaign. There's a document, and I'm sure that the typed up version was destroyed. It was probably, but the notes survived, which show that Haldeman was in the meeting with Mitchell when they decided to hire Liddy to do campaign espionage. That was always something the Nixonians denied, and Haldeman himself denied. We have the proof. What had happened is when they had their shredding party in the summer of '72, they had missed a lot of the notes, the drafts. And so these showed knowledge. For example, another thing, when Mitchell decides, and John is a very important, the story that he told about the nonsense on TV shows the verse of what really happened, which is he thought this was a bad idea. But when Mitchell finally decides to approve a budget, smaller than asked for, but a budget for G. Gordon Liddy's craziness, he approves a certain number of operations. Again, the White House always said it had no knowledge of these operations. There was a draft that showed that Mitchell's guy communicated with Haldeman's guy and said, we're going ahead with 2 operations rather than 4. And then Haldeman later says, stop working on Muskie, because he was no longer a leading Democratic candidate, shift those operations against McGovern. So it was clear that the White House had operational understanding of the break-ins. Not the big one, that we can't prove, but the fact that Haldeman knew the number of operations, that was something we couldn't prove until 2008.
Just let me footnote that remark where you said Watergate's the big one. Watergate was actually the small one. The night they're arrested in the Watergate, they're actually leaving and following the order that's traceable directly to the Oval Office to change from Muskie to McGovern. And they're headed to McGovern's office on Capitol Hill, where they're going to insert bugs. And they have them all in the Watergate complex with them, but they get arrested at the Democratic National Committee trying to repair a defective bug before they get to Muskie's headquarters. So if they had been arrested in Muskie's headquarters, McGovern's headquarters, instead of the Watergate committee or the Democratic committee, it would have been a very different story. You could trace it directly to Nixon, because he says, change the plant. And he's not talking about a flower. He said, change the plant in Muskie's office to McGovern.
And 2 more quick things that should resonate. Number 1, when I heard the tape of Richard Nixon and Haldeman discussing breaking the bones of anti-war demonstrators, that they had hired 5 Teamsters to break the bones, that to me was chilling. I mean, I still think it's, I mean, when we talk about weaponization, if anybody talks to you about the weaponization of the federal government, have them listen to a tape from May 1973. That's weaponization. And the other was the Nixon tape, where he wants he says that Jews cannot be trusted. They are anti-American, and there should be a Gentile over every Jew in an important position in the federal government. And then later, when Nixon denies the Holocaust on another tape, says it was much smaller, the Jews exaggerated because they need it. To me, that settled the case of what was at the center of the 37th President of the United States.
I hadn't heard that one.
I can tell you where it is.
Okay.
Well, there's a...
It's not online, is what you're saying.
It is online.
Oh, it is online?
Oh, yeah. No. We put everything on. No. We put everything online. No. It's online. It's a.
But
horrific.
you have to know where to look.
You have to know. I mean, they're.
Well, yet another tape has President Nixon telling Henry Kissinger, the press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. Write that on the blackboard 100 times and never forget it. And so, of course, you know, the distrust of presidents and press is hardly unique to Nixon. But I want to come back to sort of, as we close, and by the way, I want to invite people to begin to move their way towards the microphones that are set up. If you have a question for our speakers, we'll do as many as we can. In a few minutes, as you come up to the mics, it is being recorded, as John mentioned, so we need you at the mic, but make your way over there shortly. The question really is about again, this sort of the through line of Watergate. John, you've written a lot of books, right? Not all of them about Watergate. Many of them about contemporary political events, things that have moved through time and, you know, are still relevant, right? You talked about maybe putting the phrase, putting a cap on Watergate, but we don't seem to be able to do that in some ways. Not too long ago, you wrote a piece about partisan media, and in fact, whether President Nixon would have been able to survive in office under today's media environment. I wonder if you could maybe start in our sort of implications section, if you will, with the media and how that
well, of course, there was no Fox during Watergate, and Fox was literally created. The genesis of Fox is an Oval Office meeting between Roger Ailes, Richard Nixon, and Chuck Colson, where they talk about the concept of creating a cable network system that is purely conservative political coverage. So this is the early stage of where Fox News originated. Richard Nixon could see the importance of having that voice. Had you had a defender of Nixon that was not interested in objectivity, but rather the politics of what was happening, Watergate might have turned out very differently. The what-if questions are tough, but it certainly would have changed the atmosphere that didn't exist. We had a half-hour ABC, NBC, CBS, right down the middle kind of coverage in that era, and it was straight. It was honest journalism. They weren't pounding anybody's drum. Did some reporters think it was important, like Walter Cronkite? Yes, he did. But he was getting most of his material from the media, from the print press. Also, there's an interesting phenomenon during Watergate. It starts out as a very local story inside the Washington Beltway and doesn't really spread until the trial of the initial burglars and Hunt and Liddy. That's when Cy Hirsch comes on to work in January of '73 for the New York Times. Cy Hirsch I know both Bob and Carl very well. I know Cy Hirsch very well. I've told them both. The only stories that really gave the White House a chill that somebody was getting on to what was really going on was Cy Hirsch's coverage of the fact that Cubans were receiving money. He sort of broke through all that dust, and well, why are you getting paid? Well, we're getting paid to pay our lawyers. What are you going to do if you don't get paid? We're going to talk. You know, it became kind of clear that there was a scheme here. And as I say, Cy Hirsch never really has gotten the credit for that, but he changed the dynamics of the press coverage with that breakthrough.
When Walter Cronkite decides to air long-form journalism about Watergate in October of 1972, that's the first time that television really takes notice in a big way, as John mentioned. It turns out that the Nixon White House took notice, and Walter Cronkite had intended to have two long programs, and the White House put pressure on CBS, and they edited the second one to change it.
He goes to the top. Colson.
Colson went to Paley.
Yep.
So you have fewer outlets, but you have also a federal government, or in this White House, let's not blame the entire government, the White House playing politics with the media, and there were pressure points. I just want to throw out there one thing that might be worth thinking about when you think about Nixon's power and why until April, April of '73, there was no sense that he might be in danger. It's not just the fact that he could put pressure on the media. He wasn't popular with elected officials. Nixon.
He didn't help them at all.
He didn't help them at all. They didn't like him. And one of the things that his successors, I've tried not to mention this man's name, but one of the more famous successor did was to help people get elected to Congress. And then that person was owed. Nixon didn't do that. And so many Republicans disliked him. And there was a push to get Nixon to resign among elected Republicans months before the impeachment, the public impeachment hearings. What they discovered, though, was that Nixon had a base. And let's keep in mind that Richard Nixon had won a landslide victory in 1972, and a lot of these Republicans were getting pushback from home, people saying, you've got to stand up for the president. But one of the things that Nixon didn't get, that Trump, for example, would get, were surrogates in Washington who were willing to carry his water, on TV for him.
And he complains a lot about it.
A lot of it, but so you don't have Ted Cruz's and don't have them doing this. They don't like him. So that's one factor that worked against Nixon's efforts to survive, his presidency to survive, and I think influenced the media culture. And some of these members of Congress helped the media, right? They leaked, and so the media environment is also shaped in a way that's not helpful to Nixon by leaking from members of Congress. And not all that leaking, I think, was done by Democrats.
Well, it's worth circling back, I think, to again, 50 years ago, politics is different. You've got a very different kind of, Democratic Party. We still have a lot of Southern Democrats in Congress, and Nixon actually counts on them as allies on House Judiciary, among other places. You have...
I don't know how different they are as how they have shifted places.
Yeah.
The conservative Democrats have moved to the Republican Party. The progressive Republicans have become independents. And it's sort of this shifting more than...
right, a sorting.
They're sorting, yes.
Yeah. No, for sure, but it does, I think, matter what your party labels are, because the ability to act in a bipartisan way, right, rests literally on those labels. And so I wonder if it, does make a difference as you begin to see, Bill Cohen, for example, proud Bowdoin graduate, on the Judiciary Committee as a freshman congressman that year.
He deserves the applause.
Yes. You have this sort of interesting...
just to pause for a second.
Yeah.
Bowdoin graduates have made themselves proud consistently from my perspective.
So there you go. There's an applause line for this audience.
We've got one in Russia in jail. We've got one who's survived a Tennessee expulsion.
Yep.
And we have Bill Cohen.
Yeah,
and George Mitchell.
And many others.
George Mitchell, yes.
Tom Pickering, yeah. But again, 50 years ago, right, President Nixon did feel pressure from inside his party. You've got the famous, sort of Goldwater, Hugh Scott.
That's a myth.
Is it? Oh, interesting. All right, tell us about the myth.
It's a myth.
Was he not pressured by Republicans
He was not pressured by Republicans. I got this directly from the senator, Senator Goldwater, who is the reason I got interested in Washington. His son and I were roommates in prep school, and we are friends to this day. I met my lovely wife, Maureen, who had gone out with Barry a couple times, and he gave me we used to trade numbers. I got him to buy a house across the street from mine, so we would trade numbers, and I'd say, this was an interesting date, and finally one night he gave me this slip of paper. He said, here's a girl I went out with a couple times. It didn't click with me. Maybe it will for you. And now, 50 years later, here we are. I just talked to her before I came over.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, but yeah, the myth. Tell us the myth, the story here.
You tell the story. I just wanted to say that Nixon had waffled about resigning for a number of days, and his family had asked him to stay. But we know the evolution of the resignation speech. He had already asked his speechwriter to write his resignation speech before he met with Goldwater, and that draft, which you can, if you want to ever see it, it's in your Belinda, that draft says, I have lost the support of my party. He knew it already.
Okay.
No one had to pressure him to go.
Okay.
Yeah, what happens is that Goldwater, Hugh Scott, the minority leader, and John Rhodes, a minority leader in the House, decide, after talking to the party faithful, they're told they should go down and tell the president it's time to go. Mm-hmm. Well, they go down with probably that in mind, that they should tell him it's time to go. They have also done a nose count. They know how many votes he has in the House, how many he has in the Senate, so they can tell him the latest data. But when they get there, they are taken to Al Haig's office. And Al tells them, and he reports this in his memoir, but it was well known before then, that Haig says, listen, when you go in to see the president, for God's sake, don't tell him to resign. And the reason we've got him right now where he is planning to resign. If you tell him to resign, he'll probably do 180 and say, I'm going to fight this thing, and he will fight it. So just don't upset that balance. So this wonderful myth that these three party leaders went down and told the president it's time to leave are just that, a myth. That never happened. In fact, Goldwater told me, he said, John, he said, he reminded me of a guy I met once at our country club who'd just hit a hole in one. He said he was just beaming. He knew he owed everybody a drink, and he was just elated. And he said it's like the pressure had been lifted from Nixon because he'd made the decision.
So let me cling to the premise of my original question, having been corrected, and which I appreciate.
Well, didn't mean to correct.
Well, here's the premise though is he did resign, right? And he
did resign.
And he clearly, he felt he had lost the support of even his own party in Congress. The whip count was terrible, right? When they found it, and so does that, what's the bar now? And has it changed so dramatically that you couldn't have that situation today?
So this is I think, and John and I were chatting about this before. This is the key difference, all right, between what we experienced in 2020 and what the nation experienced in 1974. In 1974, Richard Nixon lost in the Supreme Court. Now, we'll never know everything that happened that day in San Clemente. It took him a long time to agree to say he would honor the court's decision. It was a unanimous decision, which was amazing given the number of Nixon appointees that were on the court. One of them did abstain, Rehnquist, but the others voted against the president who put them on the court. Imagine that.
He had 4 appointees.
Yeah. Imagine that happening today. Anyway, but here's the key point. He respected an institution of the federal government. He respected the fact that he was going to lose power. He wasn't happy. In fact, he nearly died as a result of this experience. He got very sick afterwards. But he respected it. The idea that he would launch an insurrection or provoke violence to stay in power, I don't believe he ever thought of doing that. Maybe Al Haig did, but I don't think Richard Nixon did. There was concern in Washington that the president might do that, which is why you had this unusual situation with the Secretary of Defense wanting to be absolutely certain of any decisions to move the troops in or near the Washington district. But Richard Nixon respected the fact that power was about to transfer. And so I've shared with you some of the ugly elements of what I learned. There is a difference between a president who commits those terrible things and then says, I'm done, and I'm not going to pull the entire country down with me.
I think he had a conscience, is one of the ways I viewed it.
And a president who wants to drag the entire country down with him, regardless of the consequences.
John, you want the last word before we do get some questions?
I would just repeat again, I think that a real distinction we've surfaced from what we've been through for the last few years, and pre-Biden and Nixon. I've had a lot of people, I've thought a lot about it, and I think that Nixon looks a lot different today as a result of what we've been through. Watergate looks a lot different. Yes, there were some things that sort of threatened democracy. I don't think they ever tested democracy. If we were to go into another Trump presidency That's what would be involved. We'd be into a test of democracy, a test I'm not sure how it would turn out. Nixon didn't have the kind of base. He had a small, he had 33% when he left, or 23% at one point, but it was soft, between 30 and 23%. He didn't have a 40% base, a big difference. But as I said, to footnote Tim's remark, I think he was a man with a conscience. We can see that today.
Questions, please do come up to the mic, and if you could identify yourself. And I would only ask that you end your sentence with an actual question mark.
I will. Thank you for mentioning the word conscience. Donald Trump retains power over the Republican Party. I think there's no question about it. Very few Republicans have been willing to stand up to him. I think there's little question about it. Those that have been dismissed, like Liz Cheney. What would it take to get the key Republicans in Congress and the state houses to have a conscience and bring Trump down?
How about prayer? I think, I've talked to a lot of people who initially voted for Trump. They did it for sundry reasons, the primary reason being taxes. They don't look at Trump the same today as they did when they voted for him initially. So, I don't know what his real base might be. We hypothesize about it. It's enough probably to win the nomination at this point, but different game. He's a different character seeking the general election. So I think that might solve some of your problems.
In 20 and 22, independents made the difference. And the issues that brought independents out to vote for Democrats or for Biden, those issues haven't gone away. I think the question will be turnout among Democrats, because we can assume strong turnout among those that revere President Trump. I agree with John, though. If things don't change, it's going to be very hard for Trump to win a second term. But things always change. I'm a historian, after all.
Other questions? Oh, come on down. No, you need to come down to the mic.
All right.
Hi, sorry about that step. I'm in Professor Rudilevich's Watergate class. It's kind of a simple question, but it's one of the big ones, I think. Do you think that President Ford was right to pardon Nixon afterwards? The implications of that.
Yeah, that's a question I've changed my view on, whether Ford should have pardoned Nixon. I understood at the time he did it, why he did it, and I don't think it was for Richard Nixon. I think it was for Gerald Ford. He was being pestered almost by the hour to get, to answer tough questions. Should this tape, should this information, should these documents be turned over to the special prosecutor? How should we deal with this material that we've got? It could have consumed his presidency had there been a trial. I'm not sure there would have been a trial. Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor, had real issues as to whether Nixon could get a fair trial, given the publicity. The law that governs that has changed a little bit today, where really if a juror says that he can put away any prior views of it and give a fair verdict, it pretty much solves the problem, unless they have some evidence that's been withheld that shows that juror is trying to deceive the court and the parties involved. So my initial reaction was I understood it. I can understand why he thought Nixon had had enough. Nixon himself has interesting comments on his tapes about going to jail. He said, very fruitful for Gandhi. He got a couple books out. He said, I think I could do that. So he didn't totally dismiss the idea that he could be incarcerated for his behavior. In the long run, I think it hurt the presidency. I think just like the decisions of the Office of Legal Counsel that said a sitting president cannot be indicted, I think that should be an ad hoc decision, if a decision at all. It was made during the Nixon presidency and renewed again by the Office of Legal Counsel during the Clinton presidency, two presidents who were threatened by criminal indictments. So as I say, I think it's an issue that hurt the presidency, and that the president should not be treated as somebody who's above the law. I think it damages the rule of law. So I have pretty strong feelings on that today, that Ford, I understood why he did it, but it was a mistake.
I agree it was a mistake. I think it would have been very healthy for the country to see an indictment, to see in one place. Of course, you get a lot of that from the articles of impeachment. You see in one place a list of the crimes that the president allegedly committed. I'm not saying it might not have been worthwhile to pardon him later, but I think he was pardoned too soon. One side note that matters about the pardon that we don't often think about, and I only learned about a long time later, was that part of the deal involved with the pardon was a deal about the papers and the tapes. That the Nixon rightly claimed that he owned the tapes and the papers, and he was right about that.
Was.
And Ford was afraid of what Nixon would do with the tapes and the papers, because the White House thought it would be charged with obstruction of justice if it allowed Nixon to destroy materials. So part of the deal was, if Nixon, in return for the pardon, Nixon had to sign an agreement about the tapes. Now that agreement was actually still not very good, and Congress would replace it, but it would have been very hard to achieve even that agreement without the pardon. So although I think the timing of the pardon was wrong, probably the story would have ended with a pardon by Ford.
Well, thank you for your testimony 50 years ago, and thanks for being here today. It's been fascinating. I was going to ask you about the courage of Bill Cohen, but you've already referred to that. So instead, I'll ask something that's maybe just tangential, and that's both of your opinions and any role that Henry Kissinger played.
I'll largely defer to Tim, who's sifted through this. I can tell you one thing: there would have been no plumbers operation but for Henry Kissinger. It's my understanding that when Nixon learned of the Pentagon Papers being released, it was the weekend his daughter was married in the Rose Garden, and a big reception on the South Lawn. He came in on Sunday morning to look at the coverage of the wedding, and the headline, of course, was the release of what would later be dubbed the Pentagon Papers. His initial reaction reading that story was, good. This will hurt the Democrats. It doesn't hurt us, it doesn't reach me. And he indeed would later start a whole effort to declassify all the Korean War papers so that it would show the Democrats making stupid mistakes, which happens during wars. So Henry was not at the wedding and didn't come back until Monday morning. And it's I have never seen the tape, and it may or may not even be on the tape, but it's my understanding from Haldeman that Haldeman said that Nixon was fine with all this until Henry told him, we can't deal with the Chinese, we can't deal with the North Vietnamese, which we have secret negotiations going on, but most importantly, it's going to ruin your trip to China, if we don't deal effectively with this leak. So we've got to go after this guy who they already knew was Daniel Ellsberg as the leaker. And with that, I think Alex Butterfield describes the White House as changing from night or day to night. It really became dark in the Nixon White House after the leak of the Pentagon Papers. Whole mood changes. So it had a huge impact, but I'll let Tim pick it up, who knows much more about this subject than I do.
I don't know if I do, but I will add one point. Henry Kissinger was very insecure. It's hard to imagine Henry Kissinger being insecure, but he was very insecure about his place in Nixon world. He'd, after all, he'd done some help. He'd helped the LBJ administration a little bit. More importantly, he'd worked for years for Nelson Rockefeller, a liberal Republican who was a longtime challenger of Nixon's. And Kissinger was also Jewish, and Kissinger knew about Nixon's dark thoughts about Judaism, particularly American Jews. And so he was insecure, and he was especially insecure about the Harvard people that he had hired to work with him. And these Harvard people, for the most part, were centrists, or some were center-left. They had deep doubts about Vietnam, and they were willing to participate in the National Security Council because they thought that Nixon would achieve what he promised to achieve in the campaign, which is to get America out of the war. Well, those of you who know something about Vietnam will know that while the US government is taking troops out, Nixon and Kissinger are trying to find ways to scare North Vietnam, basically to say, look, maybe our troops are leaving, but we're still mean, and we can do something to you if you don't negotiate in good faith with us. But while these young Harvards are watching this, many of them begin to doubt what Kissinger and Nixon are doing, and dissent towards the policy in Vietnam increases. And Henry is worried about his job. And so Henry encourages the president to wiretap members of his own staff. And that wiretapping includes members of the press corps. And in large measure, it's due to Kissinger's insecurity, because he wants to prove to the boss, I'm with you, not them. They're just these Harvard kids that were in my class at Harvard. And Daniel Ellsberg was one of those. Now, he wasn't at the NSC, but Kissinger had asked for Ellsberg's advice on the first presidential decision memorandum about Vietnam. So Kissinger was worried that if he wasn't tough enough on Ellsberg, that they would begin to doubt his loyalty. And he knew that he was never part of the tribe. So that's the dimension of the Kissinger story regarding Watergate. There's a whole different story about Kissinger in Vietnam, but that's for another time.
Let's take this one last question.
Yeah, you just touched a little bit on that divide in the Republican Party vis-a-vis Kissinger, but I've read a little bit about how like Nixon himself, you know, coming out of California, was a little bit of like an outsider to like the northeastern establishment of the Republican Party, and like that of course influenced how close he got to like Kissinger, because they sort of felt that solidarity, sort of like opposed to the rest of the Republican Party. But how do you think that divide like contributed to maybe that erosion of other Republican support for him, like as the Watergate scandal got tougher?
My reaction to Nixon and party politics is it was a pure vehicle for him, a necessary vehicle that he went around whenever he could. In fact, he created his own campaign, did not rely on the Republicans whatsoever to deliver. Went to the convention, you know, did all of the pomp and circumstance that's necessary, but put together his own machinery to win the election. And that really had happened when he was running initially, before he was the standard bearer of the Republican Party. He developed all of his own political contacts, put together his own machine, his own staff, didn't rely on the party whatsoever, and held the party in minimal high esteem, to put it nicely.
Two points quickly. One is that he wanted to create a new party called the American Conservative Party,
Right.
which would be a Nixon party, and it would be an alliance of Southern Democrats and Republican conservatives. And of course, this meant going right around the existing RNC, which is why he.
That's why he sent George Bush.
That's what I was
there.
going to say. That's why George Bush. I mean, I have great respect for George Bush, but Richard Nixon didn't, and so that's one. And the other thing, the perfect example of what Richard Nixon thought about the Republican Party, is that, and no one will remember, very few will remember this person's name, but when Spiro Agnew had to go, he was the vice president. Now, that's not the name you weren't going to remember. Richard Nixon needed a new vice president, okay? You know. Who was his first choice for vice president? Because he had to replace Spiro Agnew. Who was the one he really wanted to be vice president?
I don't know. Tell me.
John Connolly,
Oh, well,
former
yes.
Democrat. Imagine a Republican
That was the
wanting...
name on my tip of my tongue.
Well, I told you, well, everybody forgets it.
But I thought everyone knew him. So.
No. Yes. Right. So listen, well, wait, think about it. Talk about partisanship. This is inconceivable today, right? Choosing somebody who a few years earlier was a Democrat, yeah, to have in the party, that's fine. There are some people like that in the Republican Party. But to make them the number two. And by the way, the Republicans pushed back. The reason Gerald Ford becomes president is a man named Melvin Laird, all right, who told President Nixon, John Connolly will never be confirmed by Congress. The Democrats will vote against him, and we will vote against him. You have to pick Jerry Ford.
My first conversation.
A real Republican.
My first conversation as White House counsel with Richard Nixon was about the vice presidency. He called me, and the pretext for the call was he said, Tricia is here in the office, and she's doing a paper on succession. She said, I understand when you worked at the House Judiciary Committee, you worked on presidential succession. I said, yes, I did. And he had a very technical question about how to get the succession accomplished and what would happen. And it was, at the time, I thought it was a legitimate question about his daughter. And I thought, well, I can't get too complex about this. So I said, Mr. President, I'll give you a note on it or get back to you and what have you. Well, I learned from the people who wrote the book Slow Burn that this first call is that's when he's starting to plot how to get Agnew off the ticket and Connolly on. And it wasn't a homework assignment from Tricia.
No.
I haven't thought about that in years.
Well, gentlemen, this has been wonderful. As we conclude, I actually want to ask Tom Putnam to come forward to offer a brief benediction of sorts to our event. Tom's a proud Bowdoin graduate, class of 1984, and also the former director of the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston, and then an executive of the broader presidential library system at the National Archives. So
Thanks,
an appropriate
Andy.
last word.
So on behalf of everyone here, first let me thank our two speakers for a wonderful, engaging discussion, and Andy for spearheading the effort to bring them here. So thank you all so very much. I'm honored to share just a couple of brief words. First, let me just echo as a friend and a colleague the praise for Tim's work at the Nixon Library. I was actually present when he opened the Watergate exhibit, as you could probably tell from his engaging demeanor tonight. He was brimming with enthusiasm for that effort. Much as I imagine you, Tim, at that 5th grade science fair.
Yes.
As has already been made clear, we might not have fully known the story of Watergate were it not for the courage of John Dean, his riveting congressional testimony when he spoke truth to power, and as we heard this evening, literally put his own life in danger, was the linchpin to explaining to the American public what really happened. For this act of conscience, our nation, Mr. Dean, is forever in your debt. So Bill Cohen was mentioned briefly, and so I thought I might close by telling that story just a little more fully. 10 years after graduating from Bowdoin, he was elected to Congress in 1972 and appointed to the Judiciary Committee, where in the summer of 1974, as a member of the Republican minority, he would draft and support the articles of impeachment of President Nixon. In his words at the time, quote, "I have been faced with the terrible responsibility of assessing the conduct of a president that I voted for and believed to be the best man to lead this country, but a president who, in the process, by act or acquiescence, allowed the rule of law and the Constitution to slip under the boots of indifference, arrogance, and abuse." A true act of political courage by bucking party loyalists, then Congressman Cohen jeopardized his electoral future to do what he thought was in the best interest of the country. "I've set out only a few small goals for myself during my brief trespass upon this earth," Cohen wrote to a friend in 1966, a month before his 26th birthday. And then he listed his top goal, quote, "to be a person of integrity and honesty." So for the students here with us this evening and those whom our speakers will engage with in their classes tomorrow morning, we teach these lessons with the hope that when you are in positions to make decisions about our nation's future and how we portray the past, that your studies on this campus and beyond will inspire you to do the same. Thank you all for coming, and good night.
Thank you. To Naftali, John Dean, thank you so much.